Hello, my name is Tommaso Pardi. I'm the director of Gerpisa. This is my presentation for the 29th Gerpisa International Colloquium. It is also part of a collective project directed by Martin Brzezinski from the WSB on the government responses to the COVID crisis in the automotive sector. And this is a comparative project, and my case study is about France and the French automotive industry. Can the government's response to the COVID crisis stop the downward spiral of the French automotive industry? So this is the title that I've chosen. And the reason is that when you look, for example, at the general trajectory of the automotive industry in France on the left, and you compare with Germany on the right, you can see that there is a clear divergence between the two industries, which starts roughly with the creation of the single market in 1991 and increased dramatically after the enlargement of the European Union and the integration of Central and Eastern European countries in 2004. So from this perspective, the gap between the French and the German automotive industry in terms of production has been exploding and is been doubling during the last 15 years. So from this perspective, the COVID crisis is very different in Germany and in France. In France, it's a little bit of more of the same decline, when in Germany is much more a traumatic reversal of growth, from growth to a rapid fall of production. So when dealing with the French case, I have two questions. The first question is, what are the causes of this decline? What are the causes of this divergence between the French and the German automotive industry? And then, is the COVID crisis and the government's response to the COVID crisis also linked to the acceleration of the decarbonization of automotive production in Europe during the same period, an opportunity for the French government to at least stop this decline or even reverse this decline by developing a proactive policies towards an electric driven growth of the automotive sector in France, or it is actually something that is going to accelerate further the decline of the French automotive industry. So these are going to be my two main research questions for this presentation. So when we look at this decline, what is important to say that this is basically a decline that is due 100% to relocation of production by French automotive car manufacturers from France to low wages, low cost countries in Europe. So if we compare 2004 with 2019, when the volume of production of French car manufacturers in Europe has been roughly the same, you can see that during this 15 years period, the share of car production made in France has been reduced by 41%, while the share of the car production made by French car makers in Spain, where the labor costs were 12,000 euros, this annual labor cost per person, well, 12,000 euros less in 2008. Now there are 20,000 euros less than in France. So Spain has gone up from 24 to 30% of the total. Then you have Central and Eastern European countries. Here the gap is much bigger. It was 38,000 euros in terms of labor cost in 2008. Now is up to 42,600 euros. And then you add also Turkey, and in particular Morocco, where most of the recent investment of Renault and PSA have been concentrated. And you can see that the labor cost is just enormous. According to Renault data, is something around 54,000 euros in 2014. So you can see that Morocco and Turkey now represent 16% of the total production of French car manufacturers in Europe. And this has resulted in a steady, regular decline of the employment in the French supply chain. So in blue, you see the automotive industry that produce vehicles. In red is bodies and trailers. in green is electric parts, and in violet is the other parts. And you can see that everything is falling, is minus 38% during this period between 2004 and 2019. And this decline has been so regular and steady because there is an increase in use by the industry of agency workers. This is the agency workers in the transport sector as a whole, but we know that the automotive sector is the main user of agency workers among all the transport sector industries. And you can see in particular that at the time when employment was still falling, the regular employment in the industry between 2014 and 2019, well, the use of agency workers was exploding. So agency workers absorb the cycles and the shocks, and also allows this kind of not painful reduction of the employment and dismantling of the French supply chain, in the sense that companies do not need to close factory or to make workers redundant. They just not replace the workers that leave and go on retirements. Now, here in yellow, orange, you can see the part of the employment that is concentrated in France on the production of powertrains, and in particular of diesel powertrains. This is extremely important, estimated to around 70,000 workers, which is much more than 1/3 of the total employment. And the reason is that this production has not been relocated by French car makers. Basically, PSA is manufacturing all its engines in France, and Renault has three other factories, one in Spain, one in Turkey, and one in Romania, but it still concentrated a very high share of the engine productions in France. So there is a big threat with the electrification that what is remaining of the total employment in the supply chain will be gone if internal combustion engine production will be stopped by 2030 and 2035, according to different scenarios. So a big threat. Now, the question is, why in France we had this massive relocation of production, while during the same time in Germany, we haven't seen that at all? Of course, German car manufacturers have also created capacity in all these low-wage countries, but still they've maintained their production in Germany. Now, there are external and internal factors. The external factor is what is outside the scope of French government policies in France, and they're basically linked to the European level. And what I call here the German conception of control of the single market, or the ordoliberal control of the single market, which has basically governed the single market since its creation in 1991. So I take here a citation from a speech that Günther Verheugen, who was at the time in 2006 the vice president of the European Commission. Here is speaking to the European Parliament, explaining why competitiveness is the answer to restructuring competition in the automotive sector. And that is what he's saying. We must face up to global competition and take control of it, to lead, to find the best solution, the best technology, the highest standards in all areas. We will still need a strong industry in Europe in the future with world-leading companies. We don't need European champions. We need world market leaders, because it is a world championship. No state can do this. It is up to the companies themselves, but we can support them. This is clearly a vision that focuses on world competition and export-oriented companies who has most of their production in very high value added products. So basically we are talking about German car makers, but it doesn't really fit with the strategies of most of the generalist car makers, French and Italian producers, who are rather specialized or were specialized in lower added value products with a specific focus on the domestic markets and on the single market as a key strategic resource. So this vision of the single market is really a German vision. How has it been translated into regulation? Well, first, there is the enlargement and opening of the single market. The opening is extremely important. The European Union has increased competition by negotiating free trade agreements, in particular with countries that are strong producers of cars and strong exporters of cars, like Mexico, Korea, Canada, Japan. And this has been done in the perspective of creating more opportunities opportunities of exporting high value added cars towards American and Asian markets. But these strategies basically benefit only two countries in Europe. One is UK, in particular after 2008, with the success of Jaguar and Land Rover. But the main one is Germany. And if we take away UK from Europe in 2019, well, Germany represents 95% of the positive trade balance that Europe has on the export of motor vehicles with countries outside the European Union. You can see that France has a negative trade balance, and more this liberalization is going up, more the trade balance of France is becoming negative in the automotive industry. So you can see that here the evolution of the French trade balance that was in 2004 still positive by 30 billion euros and in 2019 and 2020 is negative by 15 billion euros. And you can see first is the trade balance on vehicles that becomes negative because car makers do not assemble anymore their cars in France, but they re-import the cars they produce in low-wage countries to France, and then the suppliers follow. So we can see that the trade balance for suppliers has become also negative in 2018 and 2019. And we can see that in green, the extra EU is contributing negative to the trade balance of France. And here in yellow, you can see the electric parts of the trade deficit of the car industry in France in 2020. So the electrification is not contributing to reverse these negative trade balance, is actually contributing to increase it. So 7% market share of electric cars, but 11% of the total trade deficit for France. So during the same time, Germany had surplus that were close or beyond 100 billion euros for the German automotive industry. Now, part of this is also linked to the regulations of the technical regulation of the automotive sector, which has basically been steered towards higher value products. This is in particular has been the case during the last 20 years, where more than 100 new mandatory rules have been integrated in the technical regulation for cars sold in Europe. And one of the most important one is the CO2 regulations, which is now playing a key role in accelerating the transition towards electromobility. And there was notably a report in France by for the French Parliamentary Assembly by Delphine Bateau in 2016, which pointed out how much powerful is the lobbying of the German automotive industry and the German government in Brussels. There are 57 lobbies in Brussels that cost 7 million euros per year for the German automotive industry against only 8 for the French automotive industry. And also the government have 3 officials from 3 different ministries that are in Brussels plus 1 expert against just only 1 for the French government. So the influence of the German automotive industry in shaping this technical regulation, which push the market upmarket towards more higher valued and more expensive products, is very strong. And so I've done last year a presentation on that, and there is an article coming out in the in our journal, iJudgment, this year, on the CO2 regulation, which has weight-based targets, meaning that if a car maker has a heavier average fleet, well, their CO2 targets are less demanding. And if a car maker tries to comply with CO2 regulation by reducing weight, which is the most reasonable way of doing, because this is the most important factor which affects consumption, well, actually this is not possible because the CO2 targets for these car makers would become more demanding. So there is no way of reducing weight and become compliant with the regulation. So this has pushed the whole industry up market, so more mass, more power, more size for everybody, because that's the only way of introducing greening technology, which are expensive, like diesel or direct injection in gasoline powertrains. So the price has gone up for everybody, and the market share has clearly been favorable to premium brands, plus 40%, and clearly unfavorable for generalist brands, because the market is moving away from what they sell, from the consumers they have. And electrification is more of the same from this perspective, because it's clearly introduced in Europe as a very high value added technology in premium cars with a lot of autonomy and powerful. So clearly premium brands, for them is much easier to electrify their sale than it is for generalist brands. So this has made life much harder for generalist brands like Renault and PSA to be competitive in this European technical framework. The third element has been the fact that Europe has not developed emerging markets inside Europe, which could have been extremely strategically important for French car makers. So Central Eastern European countries were expected to see their sales increase substantially after their integration in the European Union. These are forecasts of the European Commission in 2004, but the reality has not been there at all. So that means that all the capacity that has been created, for instance, by the French car maker in Central Eastern European country, cannot be used to produce locally and is used to import cars in France, for instance. And this has been due to the fact that the European Commissions and the European Court of Justice have not regulated or have not allowed governments in these countries to regulate the imports of second-hand cars, which have killed completely these markets. And finally, the whole relocation process is welcomed by the European Commission. It is welcome because it's meant to increase the competitiveness, the cost competitiveness of this export-oriented industry. So there are funds available to relocate, to create new capacity in these countries, notably by the European investment banks, and there are structural funds available for the region which lose production, which have to deal with the consequence of restructuring, so that is less painful. So this explains why this relocation process has been happening. It is outside the scope of the French government action. Yet the French government has tried through different measures to counter this decline. So there has been first the reaction to the 2009 crisis. And so we can see here that in 2009, 12 billion euros have been injected by the governments in different ways to rescue the French automotive industry. There's been the so-called Pacte Automobile, which was supposed to create more solidarity between OEMs and the supply chain. There's been the negotiation of the Code of Good Conduct in order to stop the pressure that OEMs were exerting on the French supply chain to relocate towards low-wage cost countries. There's been the creation of the platform, the French platform of the automobile, to coordinate this effort. And all of this has been geared towards a very ambitious electric plan of electrifying sales in France and producing electric cars and battery already at the time, supported by scrapping schemes and bonus to shift the demand towards this vehicle. And globally, all of this has failed. The Code of Good Conduct has not been applied. Production has kept falling, so that in 2013, basically, the policy is changing to damage limitation. So the factory of Aulnay has been closed to prevent the collapse of PSA. 750 million euros have been introduced in PSA to save it from bankruptcy. Competitiveness agreement have been negotiated in 2013 and 2016 by social partners to reduce labor costs. Also, there is a whole rhetoric of the competitiveness shock, which translated into less fiscal pressure on French car makers. But as you can see, even if production has rebounded in terms of share of the total European production, French production side have kept losing in terms of production volumes. And now in 2020 is a little bit more of the same policies. So as you can see, again, when the crisis arrived, French car makers have clearly allocated their production to low-wage countries rather than to French sites. This is also kind of inertia. If you are relocating your production for 15 years, that means that the modern factories, the lower cost factories, the most efficient factories, they are not anymore in France, are outside France. So again, there's been a strong reaction by the government, le plan de soutien from the French government. A new code of good conduct has been negotiated, almost completely neglecting the failure of the previous one. Again, the French platform of the automotive is in charge of promoting the solidarity between OEMs, big suppliers, and the rest of the supply chain. The electric plan has been replaced by Battery Alliance plan, which I think is less ambitious than it was the electric plan 10 years ago. Again, scrapping schemes and bonus are meant to shift demand towards electric cars nowadays, but this just reflects the need of French car makers to increase the sale of electric cars to be compliant with the EU regulation on CO2, which requires basically this increase in the selling of electric cars. So we have a total of 10 billion euros. I might be underestimating the government effort, but it's less than it was spent in 2009, and clearly is not enough to provide any change in the global trajectory. So employment keeps going down in a continuous way. We have announced from Renault the closure of the factory of Choisy-le-Roi, which is not producing cars, but it will be closed anyway. There is the factory of Flambe, which will stop assembling cars, and this is a big blow. There are clouds, dark clouds over the factory of Renault of PSA, the factory of Douvrin, where PSA manufacture powertrains, has announced the relocation of some of this production to Hungary. And new competitive agreements are coming. There's been the solidarity agreements that are a little bit more of the same. So again, the analysis in terms of competitive shock, and there is no contestation from the French government of the upmarket drift, so that electrification will mean more expensive cars, which will make harder for French car manufacturers to compete against premium brands in this new decarbonized segment. So the Observatory of the metal industry has forecast a 15% decline in the employment from here to 2025. Nothing radically changes, including the speculative production of battery in 2 factories in France. And if you add to that the impact of the EU Green Deal that will be translated into CO2 targets next month, the fact that PSA is now Stellantis has more scope for relocating all around Europe, and that there is still a lot of pressure to increase productivity, notably through new investment on robotization, it's not unlikely that we will see a reduction by 2 of the total employment in France by 2030, also due to the fact that this decarbonization, which is driven by EU regulation, will heavily impact what is the most important segment of the supply chain that remains French, which is the production of powertrain. So to conclude, I think that to understand the decline of the French automotive industry in 2004, the causes of the structural decline, the European level is decisive. But when we look at the policies enacted at the national level or the strategy developed by the car makers, we can say that this European level isn't even suffer, passively ignore, or completely incorporate by national policies and company strategy, so that basically they reproduce the German conception of control in what they do, and these produce more of the same, more of the decline. And I think that this particular turning point could have been, and perhaps still is, a possibility to change strategic orientation and to challenge the German conception of control of the European level. But for the time being, I do not see anything going in this direction. In previous work and in our general debate in Gerpisa, I've proposed some possible alternative policies that could be a source of inspiration to think about this challenge against the German conception of European regulation. One is the greening by moving down market, which means making electric cars not more expensive or more powerful or more premium products, but the contrary, for environmental and social reasons, making them lighter, less expensive, more low-tech than what we've seen during the last 15 years. Second option is refocusing on the single market and finally developing an emerging market in Central and Eastern European countries, which are lagging far behind in this decarbonization trajectory. And possibly when we think of the battery story that I have not really dealt with in this presentation is we need to stop thinking in terms of liberalizing. When we talk about battery, we need to think in terms of neo-protectionism if you really want to create a European battery supply chain. And finally, I think that the whole sequence, Dieselgate and hardening of CO2 regulation in Europe, is leading to just throw away the old internal combustion engine technology. And I think it's just too early and too fast. There is still the need to improve this technology. And I think that the French car makers are actually well positioned to do that. So that can be another strategic options to challenge what has become the Volkswagen view of the European market as a fully electrified battery electric vehicle market for the future. Thank you for listening and looking forward to the discussion.